some of the technologies. Ultimately, lowering costs is the name of the game, but again, tangentially, improving the services, deploying new services. And what are you going to put out there for platforms to support this? Are your compute resources scaled directly to improve services? How are you monitoring that? How are you managing it? How are you guaranteeing that all those platforms are working in concert to meet your SLAs? Or is this just a best effort attempt to meet SLAs? You know, is it planned for? And do you know, sort of the litmus test that I use is, do you know after the fact how you're going to measure success and how you're going to measure you've met that? If you haven't planned for that before you've turned screw one or cut the first PO, then there hasn't been enough real forethought and planning into that. And that's to go to a fully virtualized environment. If you're to look at it from a maturity model perspective, that would be a long ways from getting to that cloud level. And I've seen people try to take those leaps and bounds and skip over some of those steps, and ultimately you have an unstable environment for a cloud environment. So it's really important to go through all that planning, all through those steps. And I know I keep harping on that, but that's part of our methodology. And usually if somebody is unwilling to invest the time in that, no matter what phase they start in, to make sure that whether we help them with that or they've done that themselves, that it's not going to be successful. And I try to be really clear about what the steps are and why those things have to happen. Steps. See the doctor, talk to somebody who really has the experience, has done this before, whether it's a peer or a consultant or a contractor or what have you. Talk to somebody who's been through this before, who's seen the caveats, and even somebody in a different market who's done things a bit differently. Because I've seen time and time again that there's new insight all the time, and there's always somebody out there that's fresher than you, somebody out there that's done it. And seeing the doctor up front really makes a huge difference. I won't talk any more about the strategy and planning. I think I beat that to death. The vendor evaluation aspect is really important. How are you going to decide which vendors are important? Are you going to go with VMware? Are you going to go with Xen, KVM, Sun, Microsoft? You're going to write your own virtualization platform. You're not going to virtualize it all. Not making those decisions based on any particular architecture, but making those decisions based on what your business drivers are. Do you have a cost model behind this? If you're a large organization, do you have a build back and cost allocation model to your business units for consuming these resources? If these are things that you haven't thought of, they're things that you need to think of. And even in small organizations, I've seen that just so they have a good measure of what it costs. You really want accurate cost accounting and really right-size your infrastructure. You're going to see that not necessarily for the build back, but you're going to have good metrics in accounting and management to have real tight understanding of your environment and not over-provision, not overspend. Because as you know, you buy the 4 core servers today, if you buy too many of them, you miss a chance to buy some 8 cores next year that maybe get you twice the performance at 75% of the power. So right-sizing ends up being a challenge. It's a moving target. If you look at storage, that's always been a challenge. Almost every environment I've gone into and looked at, even with 1.0 type virtualization technologies in place, is extremely underutilized. Very rarely over 50, but not often over where you'd want it, probably over 75. You're certainly going to buy once you get above 85, but if you can keep it right in that sweet spot, you're really maximizing your capital investments. Otherwise, you're really throwing money away on power for spinning disks that don't need to be spinning and getting cheaper storage later. All just food for thought. A couple of the detailed pieces of our methodologies. Again, we have hundreds of documents and processes and things, but we do a lot of load assessment. There's great tools like for virtualization. There's PlateSpin and some other assessment tools. All the storage vendors have various tools for assessing load, but understanding the network load, the storage load, the server load, that's just for server platforms. There are certain different products for looking at your data center loads for power. I'm sure some of you have seen or talked to some of the vendors that are here today. Migrating virtual machines, doing the P2V, or physical to virtual conversions. That's something, if you're doing that in concert with a migration or consolidation, do those in place before you move. Don't try to do that during up what we call a pond. It's a pseudo-operational network design, but it's basically, instead of bridging your networks together when you're moving a data center, which is a pretty common way to do it, and also doesn't always work and is pretty expensive, you can set up a simulation of your new data center to test your current apps in, and to get some validation and mitigate some risk before you move those applications over to the new data center. So these are all ways to mitigate risks, help plan, assess how applications are going to behave during the move. And for any of you that have ever run into an application that's hard-coded to certain IP addresses, that's pretty painful during a move. That's something that can break in a pretty big way. Sort of the third piece, and although there's the overarching sort of process, but the management, and by management I mean the process, the methodologies, all the things that a PMO does to make sure everything's aligning with the business, make sure the tools there are there to enable all the different processes you want to implement, and that's both pre-move planning, that's during the move, and that's operating after the move. And I also think that the right tools help you forecast change. So if we were talking about things like capacity planning and making sure you sort of have just-in-time storage and networking, so you're not purchasing a lot of those commodities of hardware ahead of time, financially, over a period of time with your tech refresh cycle, that can make a significant difference. You could actually skip a refresh cycle on some of your platforms. And ultimately, if you look at our methodology, how do we do this? We'll go in and do an assessment initially. These are the typical steps. Oftentimes it's a menu and pick and choose which pieces that we do, but we'll go and assess the apps, do some application mapping, map out all the hardware, set up a move asset database, assuming we're doing a move or a consolidation, something like that. Ultimately resulting in the documentation we're giving back is helping build a service catalog where one doesn't exist, or enhancing a service catalog that fits more in a virtual environment, but really mapping those resources over to what it's going to look like in the new data center. We conduct an immense amount of interviews with people to make sure, especially system owners or application owners, to make sure we're on the same page with precisely what changes they're making and when. So we know it's definitely a moving target for a lot of these applications. Freeze windows, really critical, and then move groups. And move groups is sort of often overlooked. It seems simple, but if you look at all the application interdependencies and system interdependencies, and also power, capacity, storage, all these pieces that tie together, what are you going to move when and how? And sometimes you get to do it as a whole customer application, but more times than not, there's a sort of heterogeneous mix of different applications and servers and services you have to move because vendors aren't providing all the equipment, or there isn't enough spare hardware to do it. You have to move live applications and take outages, and that's the nature of a lot of these moves. Or if it's not and cost can be saved that way and risk can be adequately mitigated, then there's a lower cost option for executing. It's a transition process, and typically this is because these moves are also transformations, because there's an assessment of every single application or server or service it's moving. Is this a direct move? Is this a hardware swap? Is this a technology upgrade? Is this a physical to virtual migration? And there's really a mapping between how we're moving all those different pieces. So ultimately you end up with new run books and a new data center and a new setup. And accurately documenting that and handing it out a lot of things like ITIL, ITSM, a lot of process-based methodologies, make sure we're crossing the T's and dotting the I's, but also I think our experience is where we've leveraged what does work and what doesn't work to cover, thanks Brandy, to cover what, the prescriptive advice for how to deal with certain issues, how to mitigate risk. And that's sort of where the ITSM or ITILs have gaps, and you really need some specialized experience to deal with stuff. Real quick.